Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And today we're talking to two science teachers who have been sharing and writing about strategies that can help students make sense of science and religion.
I will hear people in Alabama raise concerns along the level of, well, those godless science teachers are trying to take my kids' faith away. And one thing I've tried to quickly correct and gently correct is it's the exact opposite. What we wanted to do with this book is to give teachers a lot of tools and information on how to do what they're already deeply committed to doing, and that is caring for teenagers well and then helping them learn and grow as people.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartow.
And before we hear from our guests, I think we want to wish everybody out there a Happy New Year. It's 2020.
It's 2020. It's a new decade. Do you know what we're not going to do, Dale?
What's that?
We are not going to have a compilation of our favorite episodes of the last decade from Lab Out Loud. Although,
why not?
We can.
We could. Why are we not
Maybe
doing
we will.
This?
I don't know. I kind of get a feel of all of that. Like, what were the major memes of 2010?
Oh, yeah.
Like the last decade. What were
At
the major
end of every
media,
year,
whatever.
Well, like Barack Obama put out this list of favorite books and favorite songs, and I'm like, first of all, dang, that's a lot of books. I'm assuming he's the president and reads fast, but was the president, former president, reads fast. But, we got a bunch of new things for every new year. They always talk about those kinds of things. But in particular, in the land of science education, is a new NSTA. So we've talked about NSTA changing its name last year.
The National Science Teaching Association.
Correct. And that is a change from National Science Teacher Association. So that was to be more inclusive and basically to recognize that we have always kind of...
informal science education.
Yeah, we've always looked at those kinds of avenues, and so now we're making a place for it. So that is going to be the charge for NSTA. As a matter of fact, if you go to their website, nsta.org, you can see they have a new video out there. You can get a sneak peek of the new look, new NSTA, and all the things that are coming out. Yeah, I know. Have you seen it yet?
I just watched the video, A Bright New Horizon.
Yeah, exactly. So that's on the horizon for NSTA, and
I like
of course,
what you did there.
Also around the corner is the National Conference on Science Education. That is going to be on April 2nd through the 5th of 2020 of this year. And that is going to be in Boston. Of course, their theme is Science Expanding the Vision, and that's going to be in Boston.
Oh, yeah.
And all of these conferences, professional conferences, are a great place to learn new information, get kind of like exposure to things that you haven't maybe thought about. And I think that's really what our guests have done. Both of our guests are going to introduce themselves and talk about their background and the topic of today, which is strategies and making sense of science and religion. And both of them talk about how their conversations at professional conferences kind of led to a book that they were part of creating.
So up first to talk to us about that is Joe Shayne.
Okay, thanks so much, Brian. My name is Joe Shayne, and I'm a professor of chemistry and science education at Shippensburg University in central Pennsylvania. It's one of the 14 state-owned schools in Pennsylvania. I'm also a former high school chemistry teacher. I taught in Noblesville, Indiana for 8 years before going back to graduate school. And I wear two hats at my university. I train science teachers, and I run the secondary science teacher education program, and then I teach in the chemistry department. So I sort of walk in two different worlds. And if you want something else to throw in there too, part of my interest in this topic with science and religion, I teach an honors seminar on science and religion too, which is kind of a unique thing.
So we asked to talk to you because of the book that you helped write. Can you tell us, give us the official title?
The book, the official title, we had a lot of help from the folks at NSTA Press with this, and they helped us come up with a great title. It's called Making Sense of Science and Religion, Strategies for the Classroom and Beyond. And I'll kind of scroll through my personal interest in it. My first year of teaching at Shippensburg was in 2005, which some of the folks out there listening to that might know that was the year of a pretty famous trial in central Pennsylvania centered on Dover High School. It was the Kitzmiller versus Dover area high school trial. And I won't go through all the details of that, but that's kind of what sparked my interest in the topic in general. And then it really developed over the years to where the point where I was teaching some short courses at a church where I go to and others. And then I decided to take some ideas to my major professional organization, which Lee's a part of there, the Association for Science Teacher Education, which is an NSTA affiliate. I did a presentation there, a roundtable, and that's where I really got to meet Lee and Ian Binns from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and then Ron Hermann from Towson University in Maryland. So we just got to talking. And then we decided to do some projects and presentations together. And at one particular conference, we had a pretty good reception from our colleagues about incorporating themes of science and religion in teacher education. And it really dawned on me at that conference, and dawned on all of us, that we need to write a book. So we went out and did a little bit of literature review and found there were plenty of resources for specific topics like evolution and geochronology, but we couldn't find and identify a concise and comprehensive resource for science educators at all levels to teach science in a context where students will come in with religious backgrounds that might make that teaching a little bit difficult. So that was sort of the impetus for the book, and I'd like to pass it over to Lee to kind of get his take on there, since he's been involved with this much longer than I have.
So I've been working on this, trying to crack the code on how to teach evolution in the American South for about 25 years now. I'm Lee Meadows. I teach teachers at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. So I'm in the School of Education as a science educator. I started my career as a chemistry and physics teacher. My focus for much of my career has been on helping teachers understand how to implement inquiry-based science. And then I've also, as a lifelong Southerner, I am interested deeply in how teachers can teach evolution in ways that don't throw children into turmoil, especially children who come from religious backgrounds that cause them to wonder or even fear learning evolution. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian home. I was afraid of learning evolution as like a ninth grader, and then again as a college freshman when I took my biology courses. And the more I looked at it as a science teacher and a science educator, the more I began to realize there had to be a way forward for helping teachers see how they could teach evolution, but without throwing kids into turmoil. And I've been working on that for a long time. Like I said, wrote a book that was more focused on the logistics of what a unit might look like on teaching evolution. And then I have been doing NSTA presentations, regional and national, for teachers for years on teaching evolution in ways that's non-confrontational. Done a lot with my state affiliate, Alabama Science Teachers Association. So then when, as Joe mentioned, when we started meeting together, this book just seemed to be the next logical step in all of that work because of how it paints the big picture of the issues that teachers need to know if they're going to help kids do what the title says, making sense of science religion in the classroom. And we think that's valuable, necessary, and valid.
Sure. You mentioned throwing kids into turmoil twice now. Can you describe that a little bit? What are some of the characteristics of when things go wrong?
Yeah, kids who come from a fundamentalist Christian background like I did, or in the research that I've done, almost any fundamentalist tradition, that could be very conservative branches of Judaism or the Muslim faith. When you come at science from a fundamentalist perspective, you really feel torn. You feel like that the science that you're being taught contradicts the holy writings that you're being taught, and there's no way that those two can be in any kind of harmony. And so then it becomes, as probably almost every science teacher knows, it can become a fight in the classroom. It can become a fight within the school and the community, at the state level, policy, all of that. And in the midst of it, they're just these children who are teenagers who really feel like they have to choose. Then that's the part that distresses me the most, is they feel like they have to choose between the faith that they're being taught at home and the science they're being taught in school. And I think that's a false dichotomy, something that we shouldn't force kids into making that choice, because there's so many scientists out there who are people of faith and also deeply involved in science. And yet so often in the American science classroom, it comes across to kids that they can't do both.
Right. And I have actually, when I was teaching in like biology in the classroom, I often had students that would tell me that their church had almost like preempted them to armed them almost against anything that might be taught in the science curriculum there. And again, I had students who felt like it was an either or situation instead of yes and kind of a scenario.
Well, we've definitely seen students come to the classroom with talking points that they've gotten from their church. I have had colleagues that have encountered that on kind of a regular basis, almost looking for a challenge.
Yeah, I was that kid. I grew up in North Mississippi in a church, and some beautiful things happened for me in that church. But also, I went to ninth grade biology primed and ready to argue with the teacher.
Was that you initiating that, or were you having adults give you like the material to go do that?
Both.
Okay.
I was hearing things at my church that made me think that I needed to do that kind of battling for the truth. But also I was a pretty nerdy science kid, so I was also reading things, reading tracts from my church, trying to figure things out for myself. So in a lot of senses, I was asking what I thought were honest questions.
Mm-hmm.
The hard part for me was at church, when I asked questions, I heard some people who ask those kind of questions end up in hell.
Mm-hmm.
And at school, I was hearing, this is a science classroom. We don't ask those kind of questions here.
Yeah, I had the similar.
And I'm a 14-year-old, 15-year-old kid who just has questions.
Yeah, I was in a similar case. I went to a Catholic school, and I remember distinctly asking about, like, what about the fish for the ark story? And, because we ice fished. And that's the association I was making in third grade, like, fish were left behind. Are they therefore evil and things like that? And yeah, those were authentic questions. I wasn't following a script or anything.
And then for me, what I think the hard thing is what happened with me, and I think what happens with a whole lot of kids is I just stopped asking questions, both at church and in school.
Oh.
And that's not a good thing for a kid to do when they have these deep, big questions. And I just started being silent about all that.
I even had a student who was interested in going down a career path in medicine, but told me as a junior, I don't want to do that because I know I'll have to take classes that contradict my beliefs. And we sat down and had a conversation about it, and I was trying to tell her that, no, it doesn't have to be that way. And but I also felt like I didn't have a lot of ammunition to, I guess, help her make an informed decision.
Well, not only contradicting beliefs, it could be your role with faith, but it also can just be the fact that it's sort of, in a way, attacking people you love in your family, things like that. So it'd be like, oh, this person is very, very special to me, yet I feel like you're pitting me against that person.
Yeah. Well, then what we did in the book, we took a stance really to say that the role for a science teacher to take in the classroom, that a science teacher's proper role is to teach the science, of course, but to teach, like in the case of evolution, teaching for understanding, but not necessarily for belief. We don't feel like it's the role of the teacher to try and get kids to believe any certain thing, to change kids' deeply held religious beliefs. I sent my sons to public school, and if public school teachers had tried to attack the beliefs that I was teaching them at home, I would have had a problem with that. But we tried to free up teachers in the book to say, no, your role is to help kids understand the science. That's the key thing. Understand the evidence, understand how scientists explain the evidence, sticking to natural law. But at the end of the day, what kids believe is just what they believe. And, any high school teacher knows that teenagers have their own beliefs, and they're going to believe what they want to believe no matter what we say as high school teachers. So why don't we take the load off of teachers' shoulders of trying to get belief change?
How is understanding different from belief, though?
Joe, you want to talk a little about that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, Lee and a couple of colleagues of mine that teach high school earth science and biology here in central Pennsylvania, and then another teacher that teaches at a Christian school in Michigan co-wrote the chapter for middle school and high school teachers that Lee wrote for the book. And they try to make a very clear distinction between understanding and looking at the evidence. And Lee's book that he mentioned before that he wrote, which is an inquiry-based approach to evolution, is just that. It's approaching it from an inquiry-based standpoint and asking the students, like we all do in all of our classes, is to, here's the evidence, let's draw some conclusions, and if it impacts belief as a collateral effect, okay, but that's not really the impetus. We're going for the knowledge, not the belief. And there's people will discuss that philosophically, that believing is accepting something without necessarily having evidence, but understanding it's evidence-based. So it's more in line with what science teachers do. Okay. And a lot of what we do in the book, and I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, the middle part of the book is in 3 parts. So the middle part of the book, there are chapters. There's a chapter for pre-K through or elementary school teachers, if you will, a chapter for middle school and high school, a chapter for college instructors, and then a chapter for informal science educators. So we try to have a developmental approach there. But what we also do in the first part of the book is really for science educators themselves to understand, where do these issues even arise, so that it's not really an ad hoc response to what students say when they come into the classroom, but giving them some sociological background, some historical background, some legal background, quite frankly, so that they're better prepared to understand the context of why science and religion and evolution in particular can be such a recurring problem almost exclusively in the United States. There are pockets around the world which we mentioned somewhat, but we wanted to focus the book on for science, the audience being science educators, primarily in the United States. There's more that can be done, but we didn't want to make it to be absolutely overly long book. So and we asked all of our authors to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just curious what your approach might look like at the elementary level versus like a secondary level. Why? I like that you divided it up into those age bands there, but what can you tell us about how you approached it from those 2 levels, for instance?
Sure. I'll get started, and then Lee can maybe pick up the baton into the secondary level. 2 colleagues of ours wrote the chapter for the elementary level. One is one of the editors on the book, Ian Binn, who's at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and then Mark Bloom, who teaches at Dallas Baptist University, so a religious associated school. So they both do science and then teacher education at their respective institutions. And the approach that they took with the elementary one is not really addressing religious themes specifically, but simply having students understand what science is. So if you will, sort of a toned down version of nature of science.
Okay.
How does science approach a particular problem?
Setting the foundation.
Empiricism, testability. Exactly. That's the best way to put it. It's setting the foundation for what is the nature of science that can then be picked up and made into a more sophisticated philosophy of science, history of science, as the students progress into middle school and high school, and a more sophisticated version of inquiry, which is certainly where Lee can pick up with that.
Yeah. So I'm glad Joe brought up the idea of nature of science, because one of the things that we do in the book in trying to help science teachers wrap their heads around this issue is that is a ways of knowing approach, that we as humans know a lot about the world through different ways. Science is one way of knowing it, but there's also history or philosophy. Religion is a way of knowing the world for many people, literature. So then you can have that K-12 piece of how kids, as they're going through school, are getting better and better understandings of what science is, how it relies on evidence, how it relies on explanations based on natural law. And that starts in those elementary years. But then, and in those elementary years, of course, that is not the time to teach kids evolution. That's much too big of an idea. It's much too abstract and complex. So that one really won't come up in elementary. But then as we get into middle school and high school, and the idea of evolution, especially speciation, origins of species, begins to be unfolded in front of kids, you can take that ways of knowing idea, and a science teacher can say, well, this is the way we know it from a scientific perspective, but then can open the door for kids to talk about other ways of knowing and where the strengths and weaknesses are on that, but having a classroom that welcomes kids in that are seeing it differently. But still, like we said before, the key there is for them understanding the science, understanding the evidence, and the way scientists make sense of that evidence using natural law. But at the end of the day, not imposing the scientific worldview as the only way that kids should know the world.
When you are talking, you mentioned that you both are working with pre-service teachers there, especially pre-service science teachers. So is there a different approach with working with pre-service teachers versus veteran teachers that have taught a certain way for, decades perhaps?
I can get started here. In fact, when the book came out and I received my complimentary copies, the first people that got free copies were my pre-service teachers that I just had this past semester.
Oh, good.
And I gave it to them as I usually have a book that they read. In fact, I had them in the past read Ken Miller's book called Finding Darwin's God.
Oh, yes.
And in this case, I had them read most of the book that we wrote and asked for their feedback. And they found it really helpful. So in my methods course, I have them do, each of them, regardless of their discipline, to design some lessons that may or may not have religious implications for their students and how they would approach it. So we just incorporate that into our into our unit planning. But then also with them, one of the interesting things about teaching the college age students that I found over high school age students is the college age students developmentally are much more prepared to challenge the lessons of their youth and to challenge the adults that are around them. So they were very receptive by and large to these ideas and about preparing when they go out into the world. Because I've worked with well over 100 pre-service teachers, and a lot of my former students are out in the schools around us, and I've talked to a lot of them in the past, and they've had various experiences with how to teach certain topics. Some of them still tend to avoid certain issues, and a lot of them do what the colleagues that wrote the chapter with Lee do, is they'll write a nice position statement about addressing concepts like geochronology and evolution to kind of preempt some of the inevitable questions that they'll run into in their career. So I find them to be incredibly receptive to it in the college classroom. And then when they go out and student teach and talk to their cooperating teachers about these issues, which I do have them do, it's a very nice transition. And in my view, it's part of my job to prepare them for that environment so they're not shocked by it if they didn't grow up with those themes as students themselves.
I might imagine that some of them might actually have more pushback from the veteran teacher who may not be comfortable with teaching this in the classroom or addressing it in a certain manner. It's amazing though. I've had so few instances of that. Oh, good.
I think I've only had, I believe, 2 cooperating teachers. Now they may not tell me directly, but I've only had 2 teachers that I can recall specifically saying they don't say the word evolution in their classroom. Or what they do is the classic, let's push evolution to the last unit of the year and just never get to it.
Okay.
As if you can teach biology without teaching evolution. It's kind of one and the same. And I did have one instance, and it took me by surprise. It was actually a friend of mine that would teach a big unit on evolution in middle school, but then he would spend a day talking about alternatives to evolution. I said, well, I'm curious. What alternatives are you teaching? And then he told me, and I said, you might want to watch that. That would be, if somebody
Dover-esque
could really get you into trouble and get the school district into trouble for that. So I think in his case, he didn't understand the legal history from it. So I kind of politely informed him of this.
What happens if you have a student teacher who has a student that wants to opt out of the evolution unit?
Well, like in Alabama, it is part of the standards. So I'm actually working with a project from the Smithsonian that's funded by the National Science Foundation now that's implementing human evolution in Alabama public schools. So yes, if you just felt the ground shake underneath you, that I did just say that. Human evolution in public schools in Alabama. But what we're able to do with that is to say very simply, these are the standards. And Alabama is pretty conservative with how they do that. We're a course of study state. And what that means is, by law, these are the things that teachers have to teach. So because they're in the standards, there's really no really strong argument against teaching it. Now, teachers still don't teach evolution because they're afraid of the pushback from the community. But there's no real sense in Alabama schools of, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to teach because it's clearly in the standards.
Okay.
I had a student teacher several years ago, and she was student teaching in 9th grade earth science in a school here in central Pennsylvania. On the first day that she was there, started to teach the class, or I think it was before the school day even started, a student came in and walked up to her and said, I believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, so I'm not going to believe a lot of the things that you teach me, and then sat down.
Line in the sand drawn.
Yeah. And so it was the first day that she was in the classroom as a student teacher, but she was prepared. So this did not shock her. So she called me and said that this happened, that she talked to the cooperating teacher, they called the parents, they had a conference call, and they worked it out. They said many of the things that Lee just said, that this is part of the curriculum. The student cannot opt out from content of the course.
Yeah.
And they worked it out, and the parents were very reasonable about it in the end. The student was being a little bit flippant,
Sure.
but it was a calm reaction, did not escalate the situation, understood where students are coming from when they say something like that, and also understanding that this was a 14-year-old kid.
Yep.
Well, this might be the first time for kids of this age where they are facing something. They are facing evidence and explanation that is starting to appear like it contradicts their faith, and they haven't had an opportunity to reconcile those two things.
Absolutely. And that's why one of the reasons we wrote the book is we think this is just part of good teaching. When students are at that stage where they're asking those questions, who's going to help them with that? Their teachers.
Well, I was about to say, it sounds like you're preparing them, or the advice you're preparing teachers for in the book is something that's applicable to other areas too, that if you were to have some of these strategies at hand, you might be able to address other issues like global climate change in a similar fashion.
Sure.
Precisely.
Absolutely, because one of the things that when I'm working with the public and talking like friends at church or anything outside of science education, I will hear people in Alabama raise concerns along the level of, well, those godless science teachers are trying to take my kids' faith away. And one thing I try to quickly correct and gently correct is it's the exact opposite. Science teachers love their students, and they're committed to caring for their students. They are not trying to cause kids to be in a bad place or be confused or tear a child's life apart. And what we wanted to do with this book is to give teachers a lot of tools and information on how to do what they're already deeply committed to doing, and that is caring for teenagers well and then helping them learn and grow as people.
It kind of reminds me of a world religion class I took, and this, there was a variety of students in the class, and no one was saying, you're going to learn about some other religions now, and they're going to be in competition with maybe your own faith. It was just about learning
Choose
about the
a
world
side
around
now.
you. Yeah. So it was like, gaining understanding about the world around you, other humans around you, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
That's a great idea.
I think there has been a time in the past when it seemed among science teachers that science teachers were supposed to be evangelical about evolution. And I'm speaking very much using those terms from my background as a fundamentalist Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Science teachers were supposed to be preaching the gospel of evolution and getting kids to convert. And, we're saying that's not a science teacher's responsibility, or even what they should be doing. Let the science speak for itself.
Sure. Do you think there's a winners and losers problem that gets in the way here? We've had court cases. The court cases were settled in one direction. There is this kind of thing where you're gonna battle, and there has to be a winner and loser, and try to get away from that mentality.
In fact, one of the recent books that's been written about science and religion by one of the best historians of science that's alive today, his name's Ron Numbers at the University of Wisconsin.
Hey, woohoo! That's where we are.
Okay. Well, he talks about how historically speaking, this idea of conflict, the conflict thesis between science and religion, has been grossly overblown. That it has not been nearly as stark of a conflict as it's often made out to be. But in contemporary culture, where do we read about science and religion issues?
Sure.
Court cases, in state houses, in school board meetings, where those are kind of natural places for conflict to happen, especially a courtroom. That just lends itself to a conflict. But that's one of the things we wanted to do with the book, is to hopefully give the teachers, science educators of all types, a little bit more of a historical perspective by considering some historical case studies and how people have been a little bit more nuanced in their thinking about science and religion, and not having them face off with one another. And I think, as one of you said before, we're not trying to go with either or, we're trying to go with both and taking the historical, philosophical approach, in addition to being a caring teacher. Then that's the approach we want to take, is show that it doesn't have to be an either or conflict at all. But that's often how it's portrayed in contemporary culture. And it's been that way for over a century in the United States.
Sure.
One thing I think about there that listeners may want to plug into is Elaine Howard Eklund's work. She's from Rice University and has a couple of books out. One is Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think. And she just lays out there, based on some great research, that this whole idea we've been talking about, science versus religion and how it's a war, it's not a war. It's really not. Most scientists don't think that way. And then she's got another book about how most religious people don't think that way. It's really not a war. But we seem to, if we're not careful, we can portray it as a war to kids in classrooms.
Even an approach from that, like if we had some real data to share with students and to kind of approach it from that standpoint, to dispel the war at first and say, look, this is where people report themselves to be.
And we have some of that data in the first part of the book. In fact, Dr. Eklund from Rice, one of her former students, wrote the chapter for the book on a sociological approach to science and religion, and what does the current context in America really look like with respect to scientists' religious beliefs, and as well as the general public. To tease some of that out for science educators is a very, very useful chapter.
Mm-hmm. Does your book provide sort of like what to do in a scenario? Like, the student came to me with this, how to respond to that. I'm picturing like a new teacher. They're not sure. It's unsettling. They may be worried about blowback from their colleagues or committee.
Like a Dear Abby for science teachers.
Yeah, that would be, that'd be a great way. Like I don't, rebuttals or ways you can handle things that students are bringing up.
I'm trying to think if we have any scenarios. Lee, what about the chapter you wrote?
We didn't go in that direction because there's a lot of that out there, of different flavors of that. We tried instead to lay out more big principles,
sure,
that teachers can follow. And I'm hoping that as teachers read all those principles, we wanted teachers to be able to back out of the big principles application specific for their setting, knowing that it can be so different.
Yeah.
You're teaching in a rural school in North Mississippi versus a suburban school, in Central Florida. It can be so different. If you're teaching LDS kids in Utah, it can just be so different. So we felt a little bit like going into that level of specific may not serve every reader.
Well, and it might come off insincere because it'll become scripted.
Yeah, and one thing that I'm always careful of, and we were careful in the book, is we're careful not to put the weight on the shoulders of a science teacher to feel like he or she has to know everything about this one kid's religious faith. Yes, I'm a Christian, but I've got so much to learn about kids who are being raised in other faith traditions. And we didn't want teachers to feel at all like they had to be experts on world religions in order to teach science well. That's not a science teacher's job. That's not why they got into it. Instead, they need to be able to teach the science well and then have a sensitive, caring approach to the kids that are in the classroom, and they can listen to the kids and kind of follow the kids through as the kids are trying to make sense of the evidence in front of them.
For sure.
Well, before we wrap up, the book's been out for a few months. Have you gotten any feedback on the approaches and the content therein, and what's that been like?
Well, my 4 pre-service teachers that read it seemed to like it, but they're probably not an unbiased group of people. Since they had to give me the feedback, but they found
this is before or
useful.
after grading.
Yeah, it was actually before. So I think maybe they, with the reviews that they wrote for me, maybe were a little bit overstated in their glowing comments. But I think I'll take their word for it that they found it useful, and they definitely came from different religious backgrounds, a very diverse group of people, and they shared some of that in their responses to the book. The ones I think we're the most encouraged by are the people that wrote sort of the official endorsements, because each of them, before they wrote the endorsements, wanted to read the book before they did it. And the one I'll come up with here, which just floored me, was the one from Professor Elaine Eklund at Rice, who's a preeminent sociologist of religion. We've talked about her before. And the first line of her review said, "I've been waiting for a volume like this for a long time."
Oh, that's nice.
And when she says something like that, I know what we're trying to do with the endorsements is to have a big name so that people will buy books.
Mm-hmm.
When I read that endorsement, when she sent it to me, it just stopped me in my tracks, because it reiterated that there just wasn't this resource out there. There's plenty of scholarship about science and religion. You can spend the rest of your life reading it. Mm-hmm. But something specifically for science educators to give them background, to give them practical advice, and then if they choose to go outside the classroom to advocate for these issues, we just didn't see that.
Yeah, you found an open niche in the book community there, I suppose. That
is certainly what we're hoping for. So that to me was the best feedback I could have possibly gotten. But then, of course, we also had a great endorsement from Ken Miller. Mm-hmm. And I imagine your listeners will probably know quite a bit about Ken, since he co-authored one of the standard biology books and is a big advocate for science religion issues.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then the other one, which I'm going to pass this one off to Lee, because he's the one who secured this endorsement, came from an organization called BioLogos, and the president there, her name's Deb Harzma.
Yeah, some of your listeners are going to be familiar with BioLogos. It is a group of people who are many of whom are evangelical Christians and also scientists. It was started by Francis Collins right after he finished up leading the Human Genome Project. Mm-hmm. And so when Dr. Harzma, the president of BioLogos, read it, just gave us a really great review that talked about how this gentler, humbler approach will be useful for teachers of any belief who want to reach all students in their science classroom. So that was I was really thankful for that a group they are really trying to find a way forward among evangelical Christians, and many of the people listening know that that's the group, and I'm part of evangelicals, that's the group that seems to have the hardest time with the teaching of evolution. And then here's a group in the midst of all that who's saying, yeah, this kind of approach is what we need in the public school classroom.
Good. Will you both be presenting at the upcoming NSTA conference in Boston?
I'm not sure we're making it to that one, but we're going to try to make the rounds in 2020 as best we can.
Well, fantastic. Well, we'll hopefully see you at some of them, or some of our listeners will see you at some of your presentations in the future. And we wish you luck on Volume 2.
Oh, thank you so much for the time. This is a great opportunity to get the word out about it.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.